So when we compare and contrast the Gospels to other ancient documents, what do we see? Because oftentimes the Gospels are critiqued because they were written way too long after the events and life of Jesus. We can't trust them. But as we think about other ancient documents, how do the Gospels compare and contrast to them, both in reliability, number of manuscripts, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at with the question is an argument that has commonly been used to compare the New Testament as a whole to other ancient documents. So I think this type of reasoning was largely made popular by New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce. And then it was carried on by others like Daniel Wallace, who did it in a famous presentation when he debated the skeptic scholar Bart Ehrman.
Right.
But it basically goes something like this. When you compare the number of handwritten copies we have for the New Testament to the number of copies from other ancient writers, and compare the time when we think the originals were written to the time when our first surviving copies can be dated, there is quite a disparity. So, for example, we have approximately 23,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and we're waiting somewhere between 40 to 70 years for the first surviving copies to pop up. Whereas if you compare that to, say, Homer, we have about 2,500 copies of Homer, and we're waiting around 500 years for those first copies to pop up. Now, I think this argument has its strengths in the sense that it clearly shows that we need to be fair in our assessment of biblical documents compared with the copies of other ancient writers. Now, that we can't view the New Testament with sort of a hyper-skeptical lens and then take writings of other individuals from this time period like Plato, Homer, Herodotus, Sophocles, Xenophon, and others at face value. However, I do think we need to be careful when we use the argument, because we need to be careful in how we're applying the argument and what it exactly proves. So are we saying that because there are more copies of the New Testament and that they're earlier, that then the Bible is accurate, reliable, inspired, and infallible? Because I think, unfortunately, that's a leap in logic that doesn't totally compute. So if we found a stash of, say, 40,000 copies of Plato's Republic, and they happen to be from around 380 BC, only 5 years after we think it was probably authored, does that mean that Plato then is divinely inspired and more accurate, reliable, and trustworthy than the Bible? Well, no, obviously not, right? So the argument has value, but only in showing that we need to use equal scales in our assessment of ancient literature. That if you're going to be hyper-skeptical regarding the New Testament, but not so with other ancient literature, you're using a double standard.
Right. Yeah. Right. Go ahead.
Yeah. The other pitfall we need to avoid when applying this argument is using the most up-to-date and accurate numbers for the Bible and then using outdated numbers for other ancient writers. So unfortunately, in some articulations, particularly in print, that have used this argument, they've used F.F. Bruce's numbers in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? Where they were up to date when that book was written. However, the book was published in the 1940s. And just as the number of manuscripts of the New Testament have grown since then, so has the number of ancient writers. And the problem is, New Testament studies often counts the inclusive number of manuscripts, and classical scholars often count the functional number of manuscripts.
Right.
What does that mean? Well, a good portion of our oldest copies of these types of documents are fragmentary. So some are only scraps that are, the no bigger than the size of your pointer finger. And generally, New Testament scholarship tries to assemble and assign a categorized system to all these documents, and classicists, on the other hand, almost only ever count the number of copies they can actually use to read from functionally.
That's helpful. Yeah.
So what we end up with is comparing apples to orchards, because we are just in the New Testament textual critical world, in the world of New Testament scholarship, we're counting more and I think there are very good reasons for that. But when we do these comparisons, we do need to make sure that we're not maybe castigating a certain perspective on the rest of ancient literature, and then falsely propping up the New Testament text. But at the end of the day, the New Testament documents are still the most attested documents of antiquity, bar none, end of conversation.
There you go. Really helpful. No, that's a good perspective for me, because I have used probably more recent stuff, probably Daniel Wallace's stuff, not F.F. Bruce, but that type of thinking of, you know what, at the end of the day, we do need to come to the New Testament understanding it does have a large pool of manuscripts that we can reliably know what they are saying. And when it comes to ancient literature, there are a lot of these manuscripts. Would you agree to that?
Yeah. I mean, we can still say with an increasing level of certainty that we know what, say, Plato wrote, and we know what the author of Matthew's Gospel wrote. Yeah. So it's. I think that the strength in the argument is showing skeptics that they're really not bothered by the story of Socrates in Plato, and they're not questioning that at length and coming up with all sorts of theories as to why Socrates never existed. But they may be doing that with the New Testament, and that's just not fair, because we actually have far more in terms of documentary evidence, and in terms of biographical evidence. We have 4 Gospels for Jesus, which is quite unusual. There are very few individuals in the ancient world that have as many sort of different angles on Jesus as we do for other individuals in the ancient world. Socrates would be an example of that. He has 3 biographers, Aristophanes, Plato, and Xenophon. Emperor Tiberius he had 4 biographies of his life. But these are very influential figures. Jesus, realistically, he's a traveling, itinerant rabbi from the backwaters of the armpit of the Roman Empire anyways. Right. So the fact that we have anything, never mind such incredible attestation for his character, that's where I think the strength of that argument is.
Awesome. Thank you.